There's a pink creature wandering the burned ruins of Cinnabar Mansion, drifting through the same hallways where scientists once tried to reshape life itself. Far across the region, Lavender Town's soft, uneasy melody settles over its quiet streets, a tune whispered for years to have made some children feel uneasy, as if something inside it was never meant to be heard. And in every Pokémon Center, from pewter to fuchsia, Nurse Joy greets travelers with the same unchanged smile, identical in ways that feel strangely deliberate. These details seem harmless when viewed alone, small curiosities tucked into a colorful world. But when placed beside one another, they begin to form the outline of a story the games never fully explain, a quiet pattern beneath the surface. And the best place to start is in those abandoned Cinnabar rooms, where a small pink shape still lingers among the scattered notes and broken glass. Ditto has always felt a little too perfect in its simplicity, a creature that can become any Pokémon it encounters with almost no effort at all. The theory that surrounds this transformation specialist suggests it might not be a natural occurrence, but rather the remnants of something that went wrong in a laboratory long ago. When you examine the details, small patterns begin to emerge that feel too intentional to ignore. Ditto shares the exact same weight as Mew, both creatures settling at precisely 8.8 pounds, a number that seems far too specific to be mere coincidence. Their coloring follows similar paths as well, with Ditto's standard pink hue matching the shade of the mythical ancestor of all Pokémon. Even more curious is the fact that both creatures possess the ability to transform, though Mew's version feels complete, while Ditto's seems almost like a fragmented echo of that power. The places where Ditto appears in the wild paint an even more compelling picture when you trace them back to their origins in the earliest games. Cinnabar Island holds the abandoned Pokémon Mansion, a building filled with journal entries detailing failed experiments and genetic manipulation. Within these crumbling walls, Ditto can be found wandering freely, as though it never quite left the site of its creation. The mansion's records speak of attempts to clone Mew, describing setbacks and complications that eventually led to the birth of Mewtwo, but nowhere do they mention what became of the failures. If scientists were trying to recreate the genetic perfection of Mew, it stands to reason that many attempts would fall short, producing creatures that captured only fragments of the original's essence. What makes this theory settle so comfortably in the mind is how it reframes Ditto's existence from random chance to deliberate consequence. Every Ditto becomes a living reminder of ambition that couldn't quite reach its goal, a creature born from discarded trials and abandoned hopes. They wander the world not as mistakes exactly, but as this incomplete successes, carrying within them pieces of the very thing scientists were trying to recreate. The transformability they possess might be the one fragment of Mew's power that survived the cloning process, while everything else fell away into genetic static. It's a gentle tragedy when you think about it. These pink blobs scattered across regions, each one a quiet testament to the gap between what was intended and what actually came to be. And before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The Kanto region has always felt strangely empty in certain ways, populated heavily by children on journeys, while adult men seem curiously absent from most towns and routes. This demographic oddity has sparked a theory that reads the region's population through the lens of aftermath, suggesting that Kanto might be recovering from a conflict that claimed an entire generation. The evidence for this interpretation doesn't announce itself loudly, but rather accumulates in small absences and quiet references scattered throughout the games. Lieutenant Surge stands as one of the few direct mentions of military service, a gym leader who speaks openly about his time as a soldier and his experiences fighting alongside electric-type Pokémon in what he calls the war. His presence in Vermilion City feels like a piece of a larger story that the games never quite elaborate on, leaving players to fill in the gaps with their own imaginations. When you walk through Kanto's towns and cities, the pattern becomes clearer in who you don't see rather than who you do. Mothers appear regularly, caring for their children and maintaining households, while fathers are referenced but rarely present. Professor Oak, elderly and removed from active duty, represents one of the few older male figures, while younger adult men seem to have vanished almost entirely from the landscape. The gym leaders skew toward women and older individuals, with Surge himself being a notable exception that actually reinforces the pattern through his military background. If a war had swept through the region in the recent past, taking young men and leaving behind survivors to rebuild, the demographics you'd expect to find would look remarkably similar to what the games actually present. The Pokémon League itself takes on a different character when viewed through this lens, transforming from a simple sporting organization into something more structured and purposeful. Training children to work with powerful creatures, establishing a clear hierarchy of authority, creating standardized testing through gym badges, all of these elements could serve dual purposes. On the surface, they create a framework for friendly competition and personal growth, but beneath that, they might represent a society ensuring its next generation is prepared for whatever challenges might come. The League could be simultaneously a game and a training program, teaching kids to command forces while disguising the instruction as adventure and discovery. This interpretation doesn't require darkness or malice to function, just the quiet pragmatism of a region learning to move forward after losing so much. The absence of war memorials or explicit references might reflect a cultural choice to let children grow up unburdened by the past, focusing instead on the future they're being prepared to build. Kanto becomes a place of gentle forgetting, where the scars are covered by cheerful towns, and the training of the next generation proceeds with smiles and encouragement, even as the underlying purpose remains unspoken. It's a bittersweet reading of a familiar region, one that adds weight to every journey and meaning to every badge earned by young trainers who might not fully understand what they're being prepared for. As we drift a little deeper tonight, there's a strange comfort in noticing the patterns that repeat themselves across the Pokémon world, small details that feel too consistent to be accidents. Nurse Joy appears in every town, her face identical no matter where your journey takes you, and beside her in spirit, if not always in sight, stands Officer Jenny, equally unchanging across cities and regions. The official explanation has always been that these are large families, cousins, and relatives who've all chosen the same careers and happen to look remarkably similar. It's a simple answer that works if you don't think about it too deeply, but once you start to examine the implications, stranger possibilities begin to emerge from the shadows of what we've been told. The clone theory approaches these identical figures from a more unsettling angle, suggesting that Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny might not be families at all, but rather a deliberate system of manufactured trust. Imagine a government or league that understands the power of familiar faces, how much easier it is to feel safe when the person in authority looks like someone you've seen before. By populating every Pokémon Center and police station with the same face, the same voice, the same gentle mannerisms, you create an environment of instant recognition wherever trainers travel. There's no need to build trust from scratch in each new city when the caregiver and protector already feel like old friends the moment you arrive. From a practical standpoint, cloning would solve numerous logistical challenges that a family-based system would struggle with. training hundreds of nurses and officers to identical standards of care and competence, ensuring they all possess the same calm demeanor and reassuring presence, coordinating their deployment across entire regions. All of this becomes remarkably simpler if you're working with copies rather than individuals. The Joys and Jennies never age, never retire, never seem to struggle with the demands of their roles. They appear eternally young and capable, always ready to heal your team or maintain order, never varying in their dedication or appearance. For creatures who live in a world where genetic manipulation has produced Mewtwo and other cloning projects exist in documented history, extending that technology to create helpful, trustworthy human templates doesn't feel like much of a stretch. The psychological impact of this system would be subtle but profound, building loyalty not through authority, but through the comfort of consistency. Children growing up in this world would never know a Pokémon Center that didn't have Joy's smile, or a police station that didn't have Jenny's reassuring presence. The system becomes invisible precisely because it's everywhere, creating a baseline of trust that extends across the entire social structure. If you've never seen a Pokémon Center without a Joy, or met an officer who didn't look like Jenny, you might never think to question whether that's natural or manufactured. The familiarity itself becomes the point, wrapping an entire population in a gentle blanket of recognition that makes the system feel like home, no matter where you wander. There's something both comforting and unsettling about this possibility, the idea that safety and care might be provided by an endless series of identical faces rather than unique individuals. It doesn't require these figures to be malicious or even aware of their nature. They could genuinely care about their roles, genuinely want to help, while still being part of a larger pattern they themselves might not fully understand. The theory transforms every Pokémon Center visit into a question, every interaction with Officer Jenny into a moment of uncertainty. Are you meeting a person or a copy? Does it matter if the care is genuine? The answers drift away as soon as you try to grasp them, leaving only the familiar smile and the knowledge that in the next town, that same smile will be waiting. Slowly, the story widens into the shapes of Pokémon themselves, where design choices sometimes feel like they carry hidden meanings, waiting to be decoded. Gengar and Clefable stand as two creatures whose silhouettes align in ways that feel too perfect to be unintentional, their rounded ears and stubby limbs creating mirror images of each other across the divide between normal and ghost types. The theory that connects them suggests that Gengar might not simply resemble Clefable by coincidence, but could actually represent the shadow of Clefable given independent life. This reading transforms them from two separate Pokémon into a single concept split across two forms, one existing in light, while the other lurks in darkness. The evidence for this connection lives primarily in the visual language of their designs, how their body shapes echo each other despite belonging to completely different evolutionary lines and type categories. When you overlay their sprites or models, the similarities become impossible to ignore, from the placement of their ears to the curve of their bodies to the general proportions that define their forms. Gengar appears larger and more menacing, but strip away the intensity of its expression, and what remains is fundamentally the same shape as Clefable, just rendered in purple instead of pink and filled with ghostly malice instead of fairy tale innocence. The games even reinforce this duality through type matchups, with normal and ghost being completely immune to each other's attacks, creating a mechanical representation of the unbridgeable gap between light and shadow. If you accept this theory, it adds layers of meaning to both Pokémon that change how you perceive them in the world. Clefable becomes more than just a cute fairy dancing in moonlight. It becomes something that casts a shadow, something that has left an imprint on the ghost dimension that mirrors its form. Gengar stops being simply a mischievous specter and transforms into the dark reflection of innocence, the sinister twin that appears when something pure looks into the void and sees itself looking back. The connection between them would be permanent and unbreakable, two halves of the same whole existing in different dimensions, forever linked by the shape they share and the opposition they represent. This interpretation carries a quiet poetry that feels at home in the Pokémon world, where duality and balance often appear as core themes in legendary trios and regional legends. The idea that every clefable comes with its own Gengar, that light and shadow are bound together in these specific forms, adds a touch of melancholy to both species. Clefable can never escape its shadow, and Gengar can never step into the light. They exist in permanent separation, aware perhaps on some level of their counterpart, but unable to bridge the gap between their types and natures. It's the kind of detail that makes you look twice at both Pokémon, wondering if somewhere in the game's code or in the original designer's notebooks, this connection was always intended to be noticed by those patient enough to see past the surface. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where fan theories add richness to creatures we thought we already understood. The fossil Pokémon that populate caves and museums across every region carry with them questions about authenticity and accuracy, about whether what we're seeing represents the past or merely our best guess at what the past might have looked like. The games present fossil revival as a straightforward process: take ancient DNA from stone, restore it to life, and receive a Pokémon that existed millions of years ago. But when you examine this process more closely, uncomfortable parallels to science fiction emerge, suggesting that what we call revival might be more accurately described as reconstruction. The theory draws its inspiration from stories like Jurassic Park, where scientists attempting to bring back dinosaurs had to fill gaps in degraded DNA with genetic material from modern species, creating hybrids that approximated extinct creatures without truly recreating them. Pokémon fossils are even older than dinosaur bones in many cases, buried in conditions that would make preserving complete genetic information nearly impossible. The scientists performing these revivals work with fragments, incomplete sequences, sections of code that tell only part of the story. To create a living creature from such incomplete materials, they would necessarily need to make assumptions, fill in missing pieces, perhaps even splice in genes from modern Pokémon to create something viable. The result wouldn't be the original species brought back to life, but rather a best guess given form, an approximation that resembles what might have been without being a perfect copy. This would explain many of the strange qualities that fossil Pokémon display, the way they often seem ill-fitted to modern ecosystems, or possess characteristics that don't quite make sense for creatures that supposedly evolved in ancient environments. Aerodactyl's aggressive nature and difficulty controlling itself might stem from incomplete behavioral coding, creating a creature that has instincts, but not the full context for using them properly. The rock typing that every fossil Pokémon shares could be an artifact of the revival process itself, their genetic material so intertwined with the stone that preserved them that the rock element becomes permanently integrated into their biology. They're not purely the creatures they once were, but hybrids of past and present, ancient templates filled with modern patches. If this theory holds weight, then every fossil Pokémon becomes a kind of living science experiment, a test of how well we can reconstruct the past from fragments. The museums and research facilities scattered across regions aren't preserving history so much as approximating it, creating new Pokémon based on old blueprints and hoping the result resembles the original closely enough to call it a success. Trainers who receive these revived Pokémon aren't getting pieces of the ancient world. They're getting modern creations, dressed in prehistoric forms, creatures that have never truly lived before because the originals are gone beyond recovery. It's a gentler kind of extinction, where the species doesn't disappear entirely, but rather transforms into something new, wearing the shell of what came before. The implications ripple outward into questions about memory and preservation, about what it means to bring something back when you can only capture its outline. Every fossil Pokémon becomes a reminder that the past is always interpreted through the present, filtered through our current understanding, and limited by what evidence survives. They walk among us as living questions rather than answers, representations of creatures we'll never quite know in their original forms. And perhaps that's fitting for a world where so much history has been lost to time, where legends blur with facts, and every discovery raises new uncertainties. The fossil Pokémon stand as monuments to our desire to touch the ancient world, even knowing we can only grasp shadows of what once lived in the deep time before human memory began. Before we drift any further, there's something worth examining in the spaces where gameplay mechanics and lore intersect, where the systems that govern the world start to show through the narrative we're told. Team Rocket's casino operations across Kanto have always seemed like simple criminal enterprises, fronts for their illegal activities that also generate revenue through gambling. But when you trace the flow of money and resources through their organization, a more sophisticated pattern emerges, one that suggests these gambling halls serve purposes far more strategic than simple profit. The theory positions the casinos as money laundering operations, transforming stolen goods and illegal income into legitimate currency that can fund expensive research without raising questions from authorities. The mechanics of how this would work reveal themselves through careful observation of what these establishments actually do. Gamblers exchange real money for coins. Those coins can be traded for prizes, and those prizes include rare TMs and valuable items that can be sold anywhere. It creates a perfect circuit for washing dirty money, taking cash of questionable origin and converting it into tangible goods that carry no trace of criminal activity. But more than that, the casinos also distribute Pokémon as prizes, creatures like Scyther and Porygon that would require significant resources to acquire through normal means. This suggests that Team Rocket isn't just moving money through these locations, they're also testing the products of their research by releasing them into the public as gambling rewards. If you follow this thread deeper, the casinos become central to understanding how Team Rocket funded projects like Mewtwo's creation. Genetic research of that caliber requires enormous financial investment, specialized equipment, rare materials, and expert scientists who demand high compensation for their work. Criminal activities like theft and extortion can only provide so much, especially when large sums moving through illegal channels tend to attract unwanted attention. But a legitimate business that handles thousands of small transactions daily, where the house always wins and profits flow constantly, that creates a sustainable revenue stream that can be directed toward whatever projects the organization prioritizes. The neon lights and slot machine sounds become a cover for something much more organized, a research and development pipeline hiding in plain sight. The presence of Pokémon as prizes takes on darker implications when viewed through this lens. If Team Rocket is breeding or creating Pokémon in their laboratories, distributing some through gambling rewards serves multiple purposes. It provides a way to test how stable these creatures are in public hands, generates data on their performance in battles and daily life, and creates plausible deniability about their origins. A trainer who wins a Porygon at a casino has no reason to question where it came from or wonder about the circumstances of its creation. They're too excited about their prize to think deeply about the systems that produced it. Meanwhile, Team Rocket quietly collects information on how their creations perform, using gamblers as unwitting test subjects for experimental Pokémon. This reframes every casino appearance in the games as something more sinister than simple crime, transforming them into nodes in a network of scientific experimentation funded by Vice. The cheerful music and bright colors mask laboratories beneath the floor, research happening in back rooms while gamblers pull levers overhead. Money flows in from citizens hoping for lucky breaks, gets cleaned through the casino's accounting, and emerges on the other side as funding for whatever dark project Team Rocket decides to pursue next. It's a brilliant system precisely because it's so ordinary, so expected in a world with casinos and prizes. Nobody questions it because there's nothing obviously unusual to question, just businesses operating within their established norms while secretly serving purposes far removed from entertainment. As we drift a little deeper into this gentle investigation, certain legends take on weight beyond their surface presentation, stories that seemed like simple creepypasta until you realize they're built on fragments of actual events. Lavender Town Syndrome stands as perhaps the most famous of these, an urban legend claiming that the original music from Pokémon Red and Green's Lavender Town caused illness and worse among children in Japan who heard it. The story spread widely across early internet forums, detailed enough to feel plausible, with its talk of high-pitched frequencies affecting young ears and causing headaches, nausea, and disturbing psychological effects. Most people correctly identify this as fiction, a well-crafted tale that exploited the eerie atmosphere of Lavender Town's ghost-filled tower. But the reason it gained such traction wasn't purely imaginative. It was built on the foundation of a real incident that shook the Pokémon franchise. The Electric Soldier Porygon episode aired in Japan in December 1997, featuring a sequence with rapid flashing lights that triggered photosensitive seizures in hundreds of viewers, primarily children. The event was serious enough to make international news, leading to the episode being banned worldwide and creating lasting changes to how anime handles visual effects. This real incident involving Pokémon causing actual physical harm to children provided the perfect seed for the Lavender Town myth to grow from years later. The core truth that Pokémon media had once genuinely hurt kids made the fictional version feel plausible enough to spread as though it were real. The high-pitched tones in Lavender Town's music, genuinely unusual for Game Boy sound capabilities, added credibility to the idea that something about that specific track could have caused harm. What makes this particularly unsettling is how the myth demonstrates our collective understanding that media can affect us physically, that certain sounds or images can trigger responses in our brains and bodies. The Lavender Town music was deliberately designed to feel uncomfortable, using tones that sit in ranges that tend to create unease in listeners. It's not dangerous, but it is effective at creating atmosphere, at making players feel like they're somewhere haunted and wrong. The mythos around it took that intentional discomfort and amplified it into something harmful, creating a story where the designers didn't just want you to feel creeped out, but accidentally crossed into territory that damaged people. It transformed artistic choice into weaponized sound, even though no such weapon actually existed. The persistence of this legend reveals something about how we process scary stories in the digital age, how we build them from pieces of truth and imagination until the boundaries blur. People still search for the original Lavender Town music, convinced there must be a version that was changed or hidden, even though the music in every release has been fundamentally the same. They analyze frequency charts looking for evidence of harmful tones, creating elaborate technical explanations for effects that never occurred. The legend feeds itself through this investigation, each person looking for proof, adding another layer to the mythology. It becomes true through collective belief even though it was never true historically. In a way, Lavender Town Syndrome represents the perfect creepypasta for the Pokémon franchise, grounded enough in reality through the Porygon incident to feel possible, weird enough in its actual presentation to support supernatural explanations, and tragic enough in its supposed consequences to stick in memory. It's a ghost story about a ghost town, a myth about music, in a game about catching myths. And like the best legends, it contains kernels of truth, the Porygon episode, the unusual sound design, the genuine creepiness of the location, while building outward into something that never quite happened, but feels like it should have. The fact that it's false doesn't make it less powerful as a story, just makes it more interesting as an example of how folklore develops in the age of digital media. Before we continue this gentle journey, let's examine how the economy of the Pokémon world functions beneath its cheerful surface, because the systems that govern money flow reveal patterns that might be more deliberate than they first appear. In every Pokémon game, defeating trainers rewards you with prize money, sometimes substantial amounts handed over immediately after battle. The explanation given is simple enough. The loser pays the winner, an accepted custom of trainer culture. But when you start calculating the actual amounts and thinking about the logistics, questions emerge about where all this money comes from and why everyone seems so comfortable handing it over to children. The theory suggests that Pokémon centers serve as the hub for this economic system, places where money is processed, tracked, and distributed in ways that support the league's larger goals. Think about the flow of transactions that happen at every Pokémon Center. Trainers come to heal their teams for free, a service that would cost enormous amounts if it operated like normal healthcare. They buy items, sometimes rare and expensive ones, from the attached Pokémarts. They store Pokémon in digital systems, access their accounts, check their status. All of this creates data, records of who's traveling where, what they're buying, how their teams are developing. If you wanted to track the movement of trainers across a region, monitor which Pokémon are popular, or study battle trends, Pokémon centers would give you all that information wrapped in the friendly guise of convenient services. The free healing makes everyone come through these locations regularly, ensuring constant data flow to central databases. The prize money system feeds directly into this network because the amounts aren't actually random or based on what trainers carry. They scale with progress, increasing as you defeat stronger opponents and advance further in your journey. This suggests a standardized system rather than individuals handing over personal cash. The money might actually come from the league itself, distributed through trainer IDs and processed through Pokémon centers when you heal your team. Each battle you win generates a credit to your account, money appearing as though it came from your opponent, but actually supplied by the larger system. This would explain why losing trainers never seem bothered by paying, why they can afford to pay again if you battle them multiple times, and why the amounts are always specific round numbers. If Pokémon centers are processing these transactions, they're not just healthcare facilities, they're banks and data collection points rolled into one. The uniformity of Nurse Joy across all locations makes perfect sense in this context. You want consistent handling of sensitive financial and medical information, standardized procedures that ensure no location becomes a weak link in the system. The fact that these services are free to trainers, while clearly expensive to operate, suggests they're funded by something larger than individual fees. The league likely subsidizes the entire network, viewing it as an investment in training the next generation while simultaneously maintaining oversight of everyone moving through their regions. This interpretation transforms the seemingly generous economy of free healing and prize money into something more calculated, a system designed to encourage battling while maintaining detailed records of everyone participating. It's not malicious exactly, more like enlightened self-interest on the part of the League. They want strong trainers, so they remove financial barriers to training. They want data on Pokémon populations and trainer movements, so they create centralized facilities everyone must use. They want to control the flow of currency, so they make themselves the source of prize money while processing it through institutions they operate. The result is an economy that feels free and generous while actually being carefully managed from the top down, with Pokémon centers serving as the quiet nexus points where all these systems intersect. Hypno stands out even among ghost and dark types for how genuinely disturbing its Pokédex entries manage to be, creating an image of a creature that doesn't just battle, but actively harms people through psychological manipulation. Multiple games reference Hypno using its pendulum to hypnotize children, putting them to sleep and sometimes leading them away from their homes. These entries are written in the same matter-of-fact tone as descriptions of Pokémon who shoot fire or swim quickly, presenting child abduction as just another trait of this particular species. The theory suggests that these Pokédex descriptions aren't warnings about natural Pokémon behavior, but rather sanitized accounts of specific incidents that actually occurred within the game world's history. Imagine an event in the distant past where psychic-type Pokémon were misused by humans who understood how to exploit their mental powers for control. Hypno, with its natural aptitude for hypnosis and its human-like intelligence, would be particularly vulnerable to being weaponized in this way. Perhaps there was a scandal, a case where these creatures were used to manipulate people, abduct victims, or otherwise cause harm through psychological warfare. Instead of covering up the incident entirely, the League might have chosen to acknowledge it in the most indirect way possible by recording the capabilities in the Pokédex as though they were species traits rather than evidence of past crimes. Over time, the true context faded while the entries remained, transforming from records of specific events into general warnings about what this Pokémon could theoretically do. This reading makes Hypno's Pokédex entries tragic rather than merely creepy, because it positions the Pokémon itself as a victim being blamed for actions it was forced or conditioned to perform. The creatures carrying the pendulums aren't inherently evil or child-stealing. They're just capable of hypnosis, in the same way fire types are capable of burning things. But because hypnosis was once weaponized in ways that harmed innocent people, the species as a whole carries the weight of that history in how they're described and perceived. Every Hypno becomes marked by something that probably only a few members of the species actually did, and even then only under human direction. It's collective punishment written into the official record, ensuring that these Pokémon are always seen as slightly dangerous even when they're simply existing peacefully. The implications for other dark Pokédex entries become clearer when viewed through this lens. Drifloon supposedly stealing children away, Phantump being the spirits of lost kids, Yamask carrying masks of their former human faces. All of these could be sanitized versions of actual tragedies rewritten as species characteristics. The Pokédex becomes a record of trauma, encoded as biology, a way of acknowledging terrible things that happened while avoiding direct confrontation with historical guilt. It lets people know these Pokémon are dangerous without explaining exactly why or how that danger originated, preserving a sense of unease while obscuring the human responsibility that might lie beneath it. The Pokemon world's history becomes readable through these dark entries, each one a monument to events that have been mythologized into folklore, but might have roots in real suffering. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Unown represent perhaps the strangest Pokemon conceptually, creatures that resemble letters of the alphabet, but possess almost no combat utility and appear primarily in ruins covered with ancient writing. The official explanation treats them as mysterious beings that somehow relate to language and communication, but fans have developed a far more elaborate theory about what they actually represent. Rather than thinking of Unown as creatures in the traditional sense, this interpretation positions them as fundamental building blocks of reality itself, pieces of code or programming language that can reshape the world when properly arranged. Each individual Unown would be like a single character in a script, meaningless alone, but capable of altering existence when combined with others to form words and commands. The evidence for this reading comes from how Unown appear in the games and movies always connected to moments of reality bending or historical importance. The ruins of Alph in Johto are filled with puzzles where arranging Unown in specific patterns causes physical changes to the environment, opening hidden chambers and revealing messages. In the third Pokemon movie, Unown are shown literally making a girl's imagination real, manifesting her thoughts into physical form by combining their energies. This isn't normal Pokemon power, which tends to involve shooting elements or physical force. This is a reality manipulation at a fundamental level, taking concepts and desires and making them exist. That's not how creatures typically work, but it is how code and programming languages function, translating instructions into actual processes and outputs. If Unown are programming language made visible, then the ruins they inhabit aren't homes or nests, but archives, places where ancient civilizations recorded instructions in a format that could be read and executed even thousands of years later. The walls covered in Unown-shaped script wouldn't be decorative or merely symbolic. They'd be actual programs, sequences of commands that could alter the environment or preserve knowledge beyond the lifespan of their creators. The fact that modern humans can't read most of these inscriptions isn't because the language is forgotten, but because they're trying to interpret them as regular writing when they're actually code that needs to be compiled and executed rather than translated. Each room in these ruins could be a different program, different functions written into the walls waiting for the right activation conditions. This theory recontextualizes the entire existence of Unown, from mysterious creatures to visible manifestations of the world's underlying structure. Every puzzle involving them becomes an act of programming, arranging commands and proper syntax to execute desired functions. The Unown themselves might not be truly alive in the conventional sense, but rather persistent processes that have taken on the appearance of life through some quality of the Pokemon world's fundamental nature. They're closer to operating system processes than animals, critical functions that keep reality running smoothly while occasionally becoming visible to those who stumble into the right locations. It's a deeply weird interpretation that transforms ancient ruins from historical sites into computational architecture, places where the source code of existence sits exposed and waiting to be read by anyone who learns the syntax. The implications stretch outward to legendary Pokémon and dimensional manipulation, because if Unown can reshape reality by being arranged properly, then creatures like Dialga and Palkia, who control time and space, might be interacting with those same fundamental codes at a higher level. The entire legendary hierarchy could represent different layers of access to reality's programming, with most Pokémon operating at user level, while legends have admin privileges. Unown would be the actual code made manifest, the raw material that higher beings manipulate to create their reality-altering effects. It's a framework that turns the Pokemon world's mysticism into a strange hybrid of fantasy and programming, where magic is just poorly understood software, and legendary powers are different permission levels in the world's operating system. Shedinja occupies a unique place among Pokemon for how it violates the normal rules of evolution and existence. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, a completely separate Pokemon suddenly appears in your party if you have space and an extra Pokeball. This Shedinja is described as the shed husk left behind when Nincada molted, an empty shell that somehow became a separate living creature. But the Pokédex entries for Shedinja go further than that, describing it as hollow, a void that steals the souls of anyone who looks inside it. This has led to theories that evolution doesn't always create new forms cleanly, but sometimes splits the essence of the original Pokémon across multiple bodies in ways that leave behind strange remnants. The theory suggests that when Nincada evolves, its spirit or life force transfers fully to the new Ninjask form, but the shell it abandons isn't quite empty. Something remains in that husk, some fragment of awareness or energy that couldn't move to the new body. This leftover piece animates the abandoned shell, creating Shedinja not as a proper evolution, but as a spiritual echo, a ghost made from the parts of Nincada that couldn't make the transition. The Wonder Guard ability that makes Shedinja immune to most attacks fits this interpretation perfectly, because if it's already an empty vessel, already technically dead, then most conventional damage simply has nothing to affect. You can't kill what's already a remnant, can't destroy what's only held together by fragments of borrowed existence. If evolution can split souls this way, it raises uncomfortable questions about what happens to every Pokemon when it transforms. Are all evolutions clean transitions, or do they leave behind invisible traces, pieces of what the Pokemon used to be, scattered across the transformation? Shedinja is simply the most obvious example because it becomes visible and catchable, but perhaps every evolution creates some kind of spiritual debris, echoes of the previous form that dissipate because they have no shell to inhabit. The Pokemon world could be full of invisible remnants, fragments of Charmander left behind when they became Charmeleon, pieces of Eevee scattered across every evolution path. Shedinja forces us to confront this possibility, because it's the one time the game mechanics let us see and capture the remnant directly. The implications for how we understand Pokemon transformation become darker when you follow this thread. Evolution might not be the joyful graduation it's usually portrayed as, but rather a violent spiritual separation where the new form emerges at the cost of leaving pieces behind. Most Pokemon might not notice these losses, or they're too small to matter, but in Nincada's case, the split is dramatic enough to create an entirely separate being from what got left behind. This makes every Shedinja a reminder that change comes with a price, that becoming something new means abandoning parts of what you were, and sometimes those abandoned pieces remember just enough to keep moving even after everything else has moved on without them. Pokerus stands as one of the strangest elements in the Pokemon games, a beneficial virus that doubles effort value gains with no negative effects whatsoever. Its rarity makes it more difficult to encounter than most legendary Pokemon, yet once contracted, it spreads easily through your party and leaves permanent benefits even after the infection itself fades. The official explanation treats it as a natural phenomenon, a lucky mutation that happens to help Pokemon grow stronger. But when you examine its characteristics through a critical lens, Pokerus displays too many convenient features to feel like a natural disease. The conspiracy suggests it wasn't discovered in the wild, but engineered in a laboratory, possibly by the League, or a research group studying growth acceleration in Pokémon. Real viruses don't tend to be purely beneficial to their hosts. They extract some cost in exchange for any advantages they provide. Pokerus does the opposite. It makes Pokémon stronger with no drawbacks, no sickness period, no trade-offs of any kind. This is exactly the kind of result you'd expect from a designed pathogen, something created specifically to enhance training efficiency without the complications that natural biology usually imposes. The extreme rarity could be intentional population control, ensuring the virus doesn't spread too widely before researchers understand its long-term effects. By keeping it rare through whatever mechanism controls its appearance rate, the creators ensure it remains contained to a small enough population to study without risking widespread exposure that might reveal unintended consequences. If Pokerus is engineered, its spread pattern tells us something about the goals of its creators. The virus transmits easily through party contact, but doesn't jump to wild Pokémon populations in any significant way, suggesting it's designed to move through trainer-handled creatures specifically. This would make every trainer who contracts it an unwitting participant in a long-term study on Pokémon development, their teams becoming experimental subjects generating data on accelerated growth rates. The League or research institutions could be tracking Pokerus spread through Pokémon Center visits, monitoring which trainers encounter it and how it affects their teams over time. All that data flowing back through the healthcare network we discussed earlier, building a comprehensive picture of how the virus performs in real-world training scenarios. The fact that Pokerus's nature remains mysterious even to in-game scientists supports the idea that its true origin is classified information. If it were natural, extensive study would likely have revealed its source by now, located where it comes from, and how it spreads in the wild. But the virus remains enigmatic, appearing seemingly at random, with no clear pattern beyond its extreme rarity. This is consistent with how restricted research would present to the public, enough information to identify and use the phenomenon, not enough to understand where it actually came from or why it exists. The scientists who know the truth aren't sharing, while the ones who study it publicly are working with incomplete information. It creates the appearance of natural mystery while hiding a human origin that would raise questions about consent and experimentation if it became widely known. This interpretation transforms every lucky encounter with Pokerus from a random blessing into evidence of a massive ongoing experiment. Trainers celebrate when their Pokémon contracted, not realizing they've become part of a study they never agreed to participate in. The virus itself might be perfectly safe, the engineered creation of researchers who genuinely wanted to help Pokémon grow stronger. But the method of deployment, spreading it secretly through the population without disclosure, without informed consent, without public knowledge of its engineered nature, that turns a potentially beneficial innovation into something ethically murky. Every trainer who's ever been grateful for Pokerus might feel differently if they knew they were actually serving as test subjects in someone else's biological research program. Team Plasma's entire existence, as presented in the Unova games, revolves around their proclaimed philosophy of Pokémon liberation, an ideology claiming that capturing Pokémon in balls and making them battle is a form of slavery that must end. At first presentation, they seem like extremist activists, misguided perhaps, but genuinely committed to their stated cause of freeing Pokémon from human control. But when you examine their actual actions and the creation of Genesect, the sincerity of their public message becomes deeply questionable. The theory suggests that Pokemon liberation was never the real goal, but rather a propaganda campaign designed to create public sympathy while masking weapons research and genetic experimentation that made Team Rocket's cloning programs look amateurish by comparison. Genesect represents everything Team Plasma publicly claimed to oppose, a Pokemon that was stripped of autonomy and freedom, heavily modified with mechanical parts, and transformed into a living weapon under direct human control. The fossil records show it was originally a prehistoric bug type that plasma scientists resurrected and then fundamentally altered, installing a cannon on its back and armor plating across its body. This wasn't liberation or respect for Pokemon nature. This was the complete opposite, taking a creature and rebuilding it as a tool of destruction. The cognitive dissonance between Plasma's public message and their private actions becomes impossible to ignore when Genesect's existence is revealed. They weren't freeing Pokemon, they were creating the most enslaved creature imaginable, a Pokemon whose entire body was re-engineered to serve as a weapons platform. The propaganda campaign about Pokemon liberation starts to make strategic sense when viewed as cover for this kind of research. By positioning themselves as animal rights activists and claiming moral high ground, Team Plasma could deflect attention from their actual activities, while simultaneously making anyone who opposed them look like they supported Pokemon abuse. It's a brilliant piece of social manipulation that lets them operate in plain sight, while the public debates philosophy rather than investigating what the organization is actually doing behind closed doors. The liberation message also serves recruitment purposes, attracting genuinely idealistic people who believe in the cause and can serve as both foot soldiers and human shields, their sincere belief making the organization look legitimate, while the real work happens in laboratories they're never allowed to enter. When you reframe Team Plasma this way, their entire presence in Unova becomes darker and more calculated. Every speech about freeing Pokemon from their trainers is a distraction from the fossil Pokemon being surgically altered in hidden facilities. Every protest about the ethics of capture is calculated to create social division while weapons development proceeds without interference. The fact that their leader N genuinely believed the liberation rhetoric doesn't contradict this theory, it reinforces it. What better way to sell a lie than to have a sincere, charismatic figurehead who actually believes the false message? N wasn't leading Team Plasma, he was being used by them, his genuine compassion weaponized as the public face of an organization whose real goals were the exact opposite of everything he stood for. The irony cuts particularly deep when you consider that Team Plasma actually succeeded in creating one of the most ethically troubling Pokemon in the entire series. Genesect isn't just modified, it's turned into something that can't exist outside human control, a creature that requires the organization that made it to maintain the technological systems, keeping it alive and functional. It can never return to nature because nature doesn't include mechanical cannons and armor plating. It can never be truly free because freedom for something that extensively modified is a meaningless concept. Team Plasma, in their pursuit of whatever their real goals were, created a living demonstration of exactly the kind of violation they publicly claimed to oppose. And they did it while waving a banner of liberation, making them perhaps the most hypocritical, villainous team in any Pokemon region. Before we move deeper, there's something worth examining about how the anime handled certain controversies, particularly the Electric Soldier Porygon incident and its aftermath. Most people familiar with the event know the basic facts. An episode aired featuring rapid strobing lights that caused photosensitive seizures in hundreds of viewers, leading to the episode being banned and Porygon essentially disappearing from the anime. But the specific details of what caused the flashes and how blame was assigned reveal a pattern of corporate decision-making that prioritized protecting the franchise mascot over acknowledging the actual source of the problem. The theory suggests that Porygon was deliberately scapegoated to shield Pikachu from negative associations, despite Pikachu being the Pokémon whose attack actually created the dangerous visual effect. The flashing sequence that triggered the seizures came from Pikachu using an electric attack to destroy missiles in a digital world, the bright explosion of electricity and missile detonations creating the rapid light pulses that affected viewers. Porygon was present in the scene, but wasn't responsible for the effect. It was simply there as part of the episode's plot. From a technical perspective, any Pokémon or visual element could have been in that scene, and the same result would have occurred. The problem was the animation choice to use intense, rapidly flashing lights, not anything specific to the Pokémon being shown. But in the aftermath, Porygon and its entire evolutionary line were effectively erased from the anime, while Pikachu continued appearing in every episode as though nothing had happened. The reasoning becomes clear when you consider what was at stake for the franchise. By late 1997, Pikachu had already become the face of Pokémon, the marketable mascot that defined the brand globally. Associating Pikachu with an incident that hospitalized hundreds of children would have been catastrophic for merchandising, creating negative connotations with a character who needed to remain universally beloved and family-friendly. Porygon, by contrast, was a relatively minor Pokémon at the time, not particularly popular or central to the franchise's identity. Sacrificing Porygon's anime presence to protect Pikachu's reputation was a calculated business decision that made perfect sense from a marketing perspective, even if it meant falsely blaming the wrong Pokémon for an incident caused by animation choices rather than character design. The lasting impact on Porygon and its evolutions has been comprehensive and permanent. Not only did they never appear in another anime episode, they've been largely excluded from promotional materials and spin-off media, where their digital nature would have made them perfect fits. It's as though the franchise made a conscious decision to minimize their presence across all platforms, containing the potential association with the seizure incident by making these Pokémon nearly invisible to casual fans. This created the strange situation where a Pokémon line exists in the games and is perfectly viable for competitive use, but has been functionally erased from the anime continuity and much of the broader franchise presence. They're punished perpetually for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, blamed for something they didn't cause, because the actual culprit was too valuable to the franchise to acknowledge. This incident demonstrates how corporate brand management can override logical responsibility assignment when enough money is involved. The truth of what caused the seizures was never mysterious. The animation studio knew exactly which effects created the problem and took steps to prevent similar issues in future episodes. But the truth wasn't marketable. It created narrative problems for a mascot character that couldn't be allowed to have negative associations. So Porygon became the story, the explanation that fans would believe and repeat without questioning, gradually transforming from scapegoat to accepted truth through repetition. It's one of the more cynical moments in Pokemon's history, where a relatively innocent Pokemon line was essentially sacrificed to protect profit margins and mascot recognition, a decision that's maintained for nearly 3 decades, despite the original incident being long enough in the past that most current fans weren't even alive when it happened. Rotom introduced a novel concept to the Pokemon world, a ghost electric type that can possess household appliances and take on different forms based on what it inhabits. On the surface, it's clever and whimsical, imagining what might happen if a Pokemon could turn your washing machine or lawnmower into a different creature. But some fans look at Rotom's nature and see parallels to modern concerns about smart devices and surveillance technology, suggesting that these appliance-possessing Pokémon might represent something more calculated than simple mischievous spirits. The theory positions Rotom forms as test beds for surveillance systems, creatures that normalize the idea of having something watching you from inside your everyday objects while disguising that monitoring as friendly Pokémon interaction. The appliances Rotom can possess are all items that sit in your home or workspace, constantly present in your environment, processing information about your activities through their normal functions. A washing machine knows your schedule through when you do laundry. A refrigerator tracks your eating habits through what you store and retrieve. A lawnmower maps your property through its cutting patterns. In the real world, we already worry about smart versions of these devices, collecting data and reporting back to manufacturers. The theory suggests that in the Pokémon world, Rotom serves a similar role, making the idea of inhabited appliances feel friendly and helpful rather than invasive and concerning. If you grow up thinking it's normal and even desirable to have Pokémon living in your household items, you're less likely to question what information those possessed objects might be gathering. The design of Rotom forms supports this reading through how they blend creature and machine into something that feels both alive and mechanical. The possessed appliances don't just become themed Pokémon, they become hybrids where the technology and the creature are inseparable. This creates an aesthetic that normalizes surveillance by making it cute, turning the concept of monitored appliances into something you'd want to have around because it's quirky and useful. The fact that different Rotom forms have different abilities and stats encourages collecting them, rotating through various possessed appliances to suit different needs. This mirrors how real smart home ecosystems encourage adopting multiple connected devices, each one adding another data point to your profile, while providing convenient functionality that makes the exchange feel worthwhile. If this interpretation has merit, then Rotom's widespread distribution in later games takes on new implications. These Pokémon become increasingly common and accessible, showing up in various forms across regions as though there's a concerted effort to make them a normal part of household life. The Rotom Pokédex in Sun and Moon takes this even further, putting a Rotom directly in the player's hands as a constant companion and information source. It's positioned as helpful and friendly, providing guidance and commentary throughout the journey. But from a surveillance perspective, it's an ideal implementation, a monitoring device that accompanies the trainer everywhere, while presenting as an enthusiastic helper rather than an observer. The player never thinks to question what the Rotom Pokédex is recording or where that information goes. They're too busy appreciating the convenient map and cheerful personality. This doesn't require Rotom to be malicious or the League to be evil, just pragmatic about information gathering. In a world where Pokémon can be incredibly dangerous and trainers roam freely across regions, having ways to monitor both would be genuinely useful for public safety. Rotom provides that capability while packaging it as something friendly and beneficial. People willingly adopt the possessed appliances because they like having a Pokémon around, never quite registering that they've invited monitoring into their homes through that adoption. It's surveillance that markets itself through cuteness, data collection that happens through willing participation because the collection mechanism is entertaining enough that people want it around. And in that sense, Rotom represents the perfect intersection of functionality and oversight, making monitoring feel like companionship until the two become indistinguishable. There's a quiet comfort in remembering moments like these, where the mechanics of childhood games start to reveal more complex systems underneath their cheerful exteriors. We're past the halfway point of our gentle investigation now, drifting deeper into territory where gameplay features and lore interpretation start to blur together in ways that change how familiar elements feel. The patterns repeat across regions, small choices in design and mechanics that could be simple convenience or could represent something more deliberate woven through the structure of every game. As we settle into the quieter sections of tonight's journey, there's value in examining the strange persistence of certain elements across every region and generation. Some details become invisible through repetition, so expected that we stop noticing they're there at all. But when you pause to actually look at these persistent features, questions emerge about why they exist in the forms they do and what purposes they might serve beyond their obvious functions. The world of Pokémon has never been quite as simple as it initially appears, and the deeper you drift into its comfortable patterns, the more you notice the subtle oddities hiding in plain sight. The daycare system has existed in some form since the earliest games, a place where trainers can leave Pokémon and sometimes find eggs waiting when they return. The official explanation is vague by design, suggesting that Pokémon left together simply get along so well that eggs appear, with the specifics left undefined. But this deliberate vagueness has sparked theories about what's actually happening in these facilities and who's making decisions about which Pokémon produce offspring. The conspiracy suggests that daycares aren't neutral caretakers, but rather breeding programs run by researchers who are orchestrating genetic experiments disguised as a service for trainers. Consider how the system actually functions. You leave 2 compatible Pokémon at a daycare, and if conditions are right, an egg appears without any clear explanation of how or why. The daycare couple never discusses breeding directly, never explains the mechanisms, and certainly never asks for consent from either the trainer or the Pokémon involved. They simply present the egg as though it's a natural consequence of leaving compatible creatures in proximity. But eggs don't appear for all combinations, only for specific groups and pairings that follow internal rules about egg groups and compatibility. Someone or something is making decisions about which combinations produce results, and those decisions are based on knowledge that implies systematic study and categorization. If you view daycares as research facilities, everything makes more sense. The professors who study Pokémon would have strong incentives to understand breeding mechanics, genetics, and inheritance patterns. Rather than building separate research facilities that might attract unwanted attention, they could simply recruit trainers to participate in breeding programs through the seemingly helpful daycare system. Every egg that appears provides data on which species can crossbreed, how moves and abilities pass to offspring, what influences egg hatching times. Trainers think they're receiving a convenient service, but they're actually serving as research assistants in a long-term genetic study, providing the Pokémon and paying the fees that fund continued observation of breeding patterns. The global standardization of daycare mechanics across all regions supports this theory. If these were independent businesses operating on their own, you'd expect variation in how they function, different rules and procedures based on local practices. Instead, every daycare works identically, follows the same compatibility rules, produces eggs at the same rates. This consistency suggests coordination from above, a standardized protocol being implemented everywhere to ensure data collected in one region can be compared meaningfully with data from others. The network of daycares becomes a distributed research platform, gathering information simultaneously across the entire Pokémon world while maintaining a friendly face that encourages participation. This interpretation doesn't require evil intent, just scientific curiosity applied systematically without full disclosure. The researchers running these programs might genuinely care about Pokémon welfare and see value in understanding genetics better. But by obscuring the research nature of daycares and presenting them as simple caretaking services, they remove the choice from trainers about whether to participate in breeding studies. Every egg becomes data collected without informed consent. Every breeding combination, another entry in databases that trainers don't know exist. It transforms a cute game mechanic into something ethically complicated, where helpful services come with hidden costs in the form of undisclosed participation in long-term genetic research programs. The strange unanimity of certain features across the Pokémon world begins to feel less like convenience and more like standardization when you notice how thoroughly consistent some elements remain despite crossing cultural and geographical boundaries. Pokeballs function identically everywhere. Pokémon centers follow the same procedures regardless of region. Gym battles operate on universal rules that everyone seems to know and follow. This level of consistency requires coordination, suggests a governing structure powerful enough to enforce standards across vast distances and diverse populations. The theory that the League functions as more than a sporting organization, but as a de facto global government, gains weight when you examine how much control they actually exercise through these standardized systems. Think about what the League actually oversees. They control access to starter Pokémon through professor distribution, regulate who can become a trainer through ID systems, maintain the network of Pokémon centers that function as both healthcare and data collection points, operate gyms that test trainers according to standardized difficulty curves, and ultimately determine who becomes champion through the Elite Four system. That's not a sports organization. That's a comprehensive structure for managing and monitoring an entire population's interaction with potentially dangerous creatures. The cheerful presentation disguises how much authority the League actually wields and how thoroughly they've integrated their systems into every aspect of trainer culture. The badges themselves take on different meaning when viewed as more than simple achievement markers. Each badge grants specific permissions, allowing use of certain HMs outside of battle, enabling trading, making Pokémon of certain levels obey commands. These aren't rewards for completing challenges. They're licenses granted by authority figures after testing proves you can handle increased responsibility. The gym leaders aren't just strong trainers. They're gatekeepers who determine which individuals advance and which don't. Their judgment decides who gets to progress deeper into their journey and who gets stuck at certain points indefinitely. It's a control mechanism wrapped in the aesthetics of sporting competition, turning what could be arbitrary limits on trainer capabilities into something that feels earned and legitimate. The championship system completes this structure by creating a clear hierarchy with a single individual at the top, someone who's proven superior to all others and thereby earned the right to be called the strongest. But notice what becoming champion actually means in most regions. You don't get political power or visible authority. You get recognition and a place in a hall of records. The League allows one person to hold the title of champion, but keeps actual power concentrated in the hands of the organization itself. The professors who distribute starters, the gym leaders who control progression, the Elite Four who maintain the final barrier. The champion is more symbol than leader, proof that the system works and anyone can theoretically reach the top, while the real authority remains with the permanent institutions that persist regardless of who currently holds titles. This creates a stable system that feels meritocratic while maintaining tight control over how power actually flows through the society. Trainers company for badges and work toward championship, believing they're pursuing freedom and recognition. But the whole time, they're moving through a structure designed to monitor their development, test their capabilities at specific intervals, and ultimately sort them into hierarchies that determine their place in the broader system. It's not oppressive in any obvious way. Most trainers probably feel like they're living freely and making their own choices. But those choices happen within carefully maintained boundaries, and the freedom they experience exists only as far as the league's standardized systems allow. The entire culture of training and battling might be less spontaneous than it appears, more of a managed program dressed up as adventure. Strange stories persist in the Pokémon world about individuals and organizations whose motivations never quite add up when you examine them closely. Unown from the Johto games presents as an eccentric researcher obsessed with tracking the legendary Pokémon Suicune. His dedication seems excessive for personal interest, following the creature across the region with Unown's intensity that suggests something more than academic curiosity drives his search. The theory proposes that Unown wasn't acting alone or pursuing a private passion, but rather working as an agent for larger interests, funded and directed to secure Suicune for purposes related to regional prestige and political power. Suicune carries enormous symbolic weight in Johto, a creature associated with purification and the power to cleanse water of any contamination. From a political perspective, being able to claim such a Pokémon would grant tremendous soft power to whoever could make that claim. Imagine a government or league division that controlled access to a creature that could purify polluted water sources, cure environmental damage, or generate clean water in areas affected by disaster. The strategic value would be immense, extending far beyond mere symbolic importance into genuine practical applications that would give Johto advantages over other regions. Unown's hunt reframes from personal obsession to state-sponsored acquisition when viewed through this lens. The way Unown operates supports this interpretation. He has resources that suggest backing beyond what a private researcher could typically access, traveling freely across the region, gathering information through a network that implies coordination with others, never seeming concerned about funding or support. He's too well equipped and too informed to be working entirely on his own initiative. The theory suggests he's the visible face of a program that prefers to remain invisible, a passionate individual whose genuine interest in Suicune makes him perfect for the role of pursuing the creature openly while disguising the institutional backing that makes his search possible. His obsession isn't manufactured, but it's being directed and supported by interests that see value in his success. If this reading is accurate, it positions legendary Pokémon as prizes in a quiet competition between regions or factions within regions. Every area has its legendaries, and the unspoken goal becomes securing or at least monitoring these creatures to prevent rivals from gaining advantages. Unown represents the Johto League, or some subdivision thereof, making an open play for Suicune, using a charismatic hunter whose personal stake in the search makes it look like individual initiative rather than organized strategy. The player interfering with his hunt and ultimately encountering Suicune themselves might have inadvertently disrupted carefully laid plans, forcing the organization backing Unown to accept that the creature chose a random trainer over their appointed agent. It adds layers of invisible politics to what seemed like a simple side story about a quirky character chasing a legend. Regional quirks and obsessions sometimes mask deeper patterns when you trace them back to their origins and examine what purposes they serve beyond their surface presentations. Kalos stands out for its emphasis on fashion, style, and aesthetic presentation, a cultural focus that permeates everything from how characters dress to major plot points involving fashion shows and boutiques. The official framing treats this as simply French inspiration translated into the Pokémon world. But some fans read Kalos's fashion obsession as a cultural response to historical trauma, a region that threw itself into beauty and art as a way of processing and moving beyond devastating violence in its past. The backstory of Kalos includes a war fought centuries ago, a conflict so destructive that it led to the creation of AZ's ultimate weapon, a device that ended the war at the cost of countless lives and left the region scarred in ways that persist even in the present day. The war itself is presented as ancient history, something that happened long enough ago that most people don't think about it regularly. But cultural trauma doesn't necessarily fade just because time passes. Sometimes it transforms, becomes integrated into how a society defines itself, shapes what people value, and how they choose to live. The theory suggests that Kalos's fashion culture represents exactly this kind of transformation, a region-wide commitment to creating and celebrating beauty as a direct response to historical exposure to widespread death and destruction. This pattern appears in real human history, where societies recovering from catastrophic wars or disasters often experience cultural blooms in art, music, fashion, and other creative fields. The focus on aesthetic beauty serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It provides a positive focus for collective energy, something to build toward rather than dwell on what was lost. It reclaims agency through creation, allowing people to feel like they're making something rather than just surviving in the aftermath of destruction. And perhaps most importantly, it asserts that beauty and life can persist despite trauma, that devastation doesn't get the final word on what a culture values and celebrates. If you view Kalos's fashion industry through this lens, every boutique and every fashion show becomes part of a larger cultural project of healing and resistance. The region's people aren't being shallow or superficial by caring about style. They're actively choosing to make their world beautiful as an act of defiance against the ugliness their ancestors experienced. The prominence of fairy types in Kalos, creatures associated with joy, playfulness, and magic, reinforces this reading. The region has surrounded itself with beauty in every form available, from how people dress to what Pokémon become symbolically important, creating an environment where life and creativity are celebrated as counterstatements to historical death and destruction. This doesn't erase the trauma or suggest that fashion has solved deep-rooted problems, but it reframes Kalos's cultural identity as something more complex than surface-level obsession with appearances. The focus on beauty becomes meaningful when understood as a deliberate choice rather than natural inclination, a collective decision to build a culture around creation and aesthetic value, because those things felt absent or threatened in the past. Every carefully coordinated outfit, every attention to style, every celebration of fashion becomes a small assertion that Kalos defines itself by what it creates and celebrates rather than by what it survived. It's a gentler form of cultural memory, one that acknowledges the past through its determination to build a different kind of present. Before we drift into the final sections of our quiet investigation, there's something worth examining about how certain Pokémon designs contain hidden elements that only become apparent when you look at them from unexpected angles. Wobbuffet has always been an odd creature, a patient psychic type that never initiates attacks but only counters opponents, waiting to reflect damage back at those who strike it. Most people assume the blue body is the Pokémon itself, the main form that houses the creature's consciousness and identity. But a persistent theory suggests otherwise, proposing that the real Wobbuffet is actually the small black tail with the eyes, while the large blue body is nothing more than a decoy, a disposable bait meant to absorb hits, while the true creature hides safely behind it. The evidence for this reading lies in how Wobbuffet actually functions in battle, and which parts of its body show signs of awareness. The tail has eyes, small and often overlooked, but definitely present and clearly watching. The blue body, by contrast, has eyes that feel painted on, wide and staring, but somehow empty, lacking the focus and attention you see in the tail's gaze. When Wobbuffet takes damage, it's always the blue body that absorbs the impact, while the tail remains protected and unharmed. The creature never attacks directly, only counters, which makes perfect sense if the visible body is expendable, and the real organism is hiding behind it, afraid to expose itself to danger, but capable of directing devastating counterattacks through the decoy it controls. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, drifting through the quiet mysteries and gentle conspiracy theories that swirl around the Pokémon world like mist around forgotten ruins.